All right, we'll call the meeting to order. Good evening and welcome to the November 7th, 2024 meeting of the Minnetonka Planning Commission. The Commission generally meets on the first and third Thursdays of the month. The schedule and tentative agendas can be obtained by calling the Planning Department or by checking the city website at minnetonkamn.gov. The Commission holds public hearings on land use applications. From a specific process standpoint, that means we make recommendations to the City Council on rezoning, subdivisions, conditional use permits, and amendments to the city's comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, and subdivision regulations. We also make final decisions on site plans, signage requests, and variance requests, and expansion permits, unless these requests are part of an application that must be heard by the City Council. In that case, the Commission makes a recommendation and the Council makes the final decision. The city notifies property owners within at least 400 feet of the sites, posts signs on the properties, and places notices in the Lakeshore Weekly News and the Minnetonka Memo. Any aggrieved party may appeal a final Planning Commission decision to the City Council. If you wish to appeal, you must submit a written request to the city within 10 days of this meeting. From a broader standpoint, the city's comprehensive plan, zoning ordinance, and subdivision regulations are the city's best efforts to codify a balance between individual rights and community responsibilities. Individual rights are easy to understand. Community responsibilities are more subtle, but the idea is that we, as members of the community, agree to limit our individual rights for the common good of the group. The Planning Department, the Planning Commission, and the City Council are charged with managing the sometimes difficult balancing act. We ask you keep this broader perspective in mind as we review tonight's applications. Again, welcome. Staff, please call roll.
Minion.
Present.
Maxwell.
Here.
Waterman.
Here.
Banks.
Here.
Hanson is absent. Henry.
Here.
Chair Sewell.
Here, there are 6 of us seated here tonight. Next up on the agenda is approval of the agenda, and I don't believe there's any changes.
Chair Sewell, there's not a change, but just for those who may have reviewed the agenda very early on Friday, the items were first listed as consent items, but they've been moved to the non-consent agenda. So if you were an early reviewer, you saw them on consent, but they are actually on non-consent.
All right. Thank you. So I think we are ready to approve the agenda. Would someone like to make the motion to approve tonight's agenda?
I'll make the motion.
Motion, Henry.
I'll second.
Second, Waterman. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Next is approval of minutes from our October 10th, 2024 meeting. Commissioners, any changes to those minutes? Doesn't look like it. Then I'll take a motion to approve the minutes from October 10th.
I'll make that motion.
Motion, Waterman.
I'll second.
Second, Maxwell. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Next is report from staff.
Chair, 2 things to report on from the Monday, October 28th City Council meeting. The first is that the City Council did adopt the 2025 meeting calendar, which we distributed here this evening. There's a lot of colors on that. Your color is the burnt orange color. Those show the Planning Commission meetings for the upcoming year. As part of that, the council also approved moving the public meeting start times from 6:30 p.m. to 6 p.m. So that will impact all of the boards and commissions as well as the council. So starting the first meeting in January, the meeting will start at 6 p.m. The other item on the agenda for the council has to do with 1 Acre Oaks, if you remember that development on the east side of Plymouth Road. Shortly after the council approved that development and staff entered into, the city entered into what's called a development agreement with the developer that outlines all the conditions of approval. The site was actually sold. Lake West sold that property to Swanson Homes. They're a home builder. And so the city had to allow for what's called an assignment and assumption of all of the responsibilities that Lake West took on. They needed to assign those to this new developer, and the city had to agree to that. So that all took place also on Monday the 28th. Your next meeting, oh shoot, don't have my calendar here. Your next meeting is going to be December the 5th. Before that, if you're looking for some fun things to do, the Indoor Farmers Market is this weekend here at the Community Center. And Julie, you have to remind me of the other event.
And that takes place 10 to 2 at the Marsh. The Marshland Market is open for business on Saturday. That's also 10 to 2. So should be fun.
And that's all we have for our report.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, anything to report? Commissioner Minion.
I'd like to say thank you to the city staff, city managers, and particularly Hannibal for the Forestry Department for putting on another great class. There's a group of volunteers in the city that are involved in the Tree Steward program. A few months ago, we had a really nice class and we're certified through the U of M. And just recently, Hannibal and had gotten together with our friends at Hennepin County Tech and did a great hands-on class in the parks. Did a bunch of trimming. I encourage people to get involved if you have the opportunity. And thank you for the city for a great education and a great job of putting a program together. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Anything else, commissioners? All right, I just have 2 quick items. One, first, thank you to the city and all the election judges and volunteers who made a great voting experience for my family and I on Tuesday night. I don't want to give my secret away, but if you come about 6:30, it's nice and quiet. I literally didn't break stride. I didn't have to even stop. There was no line. Just walked right up, and it was just a seamless process. And I brought my kids with too, so it was great. So thank you to everybody who helped make that possible. I've had nothing but great voting experiences here in the city of Minnetonka. So that's one thing I hear from other places. We're definitely lucky. So just want to thank people for that. And then while I'm also on the kind of thank train here, I want to give a special shout out and thank you to Lauren. I hope you're watching. If not, tell him to watch the recording. I know he announced his departure from the city and actually came to the last council hoping he would be there, and I was even going to speak and say this there, but the mayor kind of moved quickly on the agenda and there was a lot of things. So I just wanted to say thank you, Lauren, for everything that you've done. Not only your fingerprints on the city, that's kind of the easy one if you look around and drive around the city, but more specifically about kind of the way you conducted yourself and also how easy you made it to work with the planning commission. I've never had any problems with Lauren. It was such a pleasure. Every time he called, every 2 weeks, we'd always chat before the meeting, and I really enjoyed it because we'd, talk about the meeting, what's going on, how we wanted to approach it, and I always looked forward to his call every time it came up. So the other thing too, not just that, but I think also a testament is just the fact that he was such a great leader too. I look and think this is going to be a compliment, but we have not missed a beat since he's been gone. I think that's a real testament to the rest of the planning departments and the rest of the city for just being able to keep and move on and move forward. We're definitely going to miss him, but the good news is he's left a pretty good legacy, both with the city, but more importantly with the staff. So Lauren, thank you for everything you've done. It's not how I wanted our relationship to end, but I still hold that hope that one day you're going to make a miraculous comeback. I've seen crazier things happen, so I'm looking forward to that day, and I'll be at the first meeting that he's back. So I still hold out hope for that. So just wanted to say thank you on behalf of the Planning Commission and current and past members. So thank you, Lauren, for everything you've done. So, all right. We will keep moving on since we've got a couple other items on tonight's agenda. Next is non-consent agenda items. We've got nothing there. And then next would be the non-consent agenda. But before we begin consideration of non-consent agenda items, I'd like to review the steps in the process and the public hearing procedure that will be followed for each proposal. First, the item will be announced and the staff will report on the subject. The commission will then ask questions. Next, the applicant will be invited to make a presentation or offer comments. Commissioners may ask additional questions at this time. After the applicant is finished, the public hearing will be open to give anyone present the opportunity to comment on the proposal. If you wish to speak, please come to the podium and state your name and address for the record. We ask you keep your comments brief and try not to repeat points already made. Once everyone has spoken, we may allow speakers to return for additional comments at larger meetings. Neighborhood spokespeople are encouraged and will be given up to 15 minutes to present. The public hearing will then be closed and no further comments will be allowed. The Commission will discuss the proposal and make a decision. The first item on tonight's agenda is item 8A, a conditional use permit for an accessory dwelling unit at 2211 Windsor Lake Drive.
All right, I have that one. Thank you, Chair and Commission. So here is our first item for tonight. If you're trying to get your bearings on where this is located, you can just barely see Hopkins High School football field over here in the bottom left corner. So that hopefully gives you a little idea of where we're looking at here. And here's a look at the existing home that's located on the property. It was built in 1962. It's a 2,500 square foot multi-story home with a tuck-under garage. Highlighted in red here is where the applicant is looking at doing their addition. That would be for both a garage and then also an ADU. And ADU is accessory dwelling unit. I have to always say that first. So here's another look from the backside. You'll see this temporary structure here, which has been removed since this picture, so that's no longer there. But yeah, the proposed ADU and a garage would go in this area, and then it would extend beyond the backside of the home. Here's a better look at that here from the front. There's existing 2-stall garage, the tuck-under garage I talked about, and then here's that garage addition. And then as you move back here, that's where the accessory dwelling unit would be located. So here's from the front, here's from the north or left side of the building, here's from the rear, and here's from the right or south elevation. Here's a look at the floor plan. As you come in, you'd go in through the garage. A little bit unique from a lot of other ADUs, there is some sort of workspaces here, a shop, and then also a storage space that's also accessible from the main part of the home or the existing garage. You'd go back, and then there's an office, kitchen, a living room, bathroom, and then in the far back, a bedroom. So looking at this, one of the first things we looked at was how far away it is from the nearest home. So this is a property to the north of the existing home. It's about 38 feet away. Just to understand, when I came out there, I wasn't sure where the property line was, but it is farther over here. So there is quite a bit of room between the existing structure and the actual property line. It's a little bit closer to that existing home to the north of the property. Here's a look at a survey that also shows the landscaping plan being proposed. So if you're looking at how far away it is from property lines, about 80 feet away from that far property line, there's that 38-foot distance so we were talking about earlier. And then looking at the landscaping, there was a decent conversation with staff between staff and the applicant, just looking at ways really that they can soften that buffer between that property to the north, since it is the closest property. And what they came up with is they submitted this landscaping plan. So it includes some trees and then also some shrubs and bushes, some hostas they're showing in there, and then crab apple trees. So they did that. That really is going to enhance both the property, but also really lessen those views, really soften them from that property to the north. So after review, staff is recommending approval of the subject request for 3 reasons. Generally speaking, ADUs support one of the city's primary housing goals, which is to provide a variety of housing options for people at a variety of income levels and various stages of life. Number 2, the ADU proposed by the applicant would meet all of the conditional use permit standards. And then lastly, the proposed addition would actually meet all of the setback standards if it didn't even have an ADU. It's something staff could have done administratively, but because there is an ADU, it does require the special approval, but without that, this could have been approved without any special meetings. So with that, tonight, this item is for a conditional use permit request. The Planning Commission is making a recommendation on that request, and a recommendation for approval requires a majority vote of 4 members. So with that, I'll turn it back over to the Chair and Commission for any questions.
Great, thank you. Commissioners, do we have any questions for staff? Yeah, Commissioner Henry.
Thanks, Chair. Can you remind us about city's maximum square footage of an ADU? I think it's 1,000 square feet. And just by looking at the pictures, the proposed footprint looks larger than the existing house. And I'm assuming that this is more than 1,000 square feet. So some sub-questions. Does the shop and garage space, does that also account for the total square footage of the ADU? And if so, what's the total square footage here, and what was the city's reasoning for not objecting to that larger than 1,000 square feet?
Sure, Commissioner Henry and Chair Sewell. A couple of things there. I'll see if I answer them all. If not, feel free to follow up. So first off, when looking at this, the garage wasn't included. That's more of a standard the city has made, that those aren't included in the ADU space. So the total space goes back from the storage area and shop, and it was over 1,000 square feet. It was about 1,200, I believe, I'm not mistaken. So with that, and then I think you asked if this required a variance. So it's more of a soft standard. If you look through the code, it says they must be no larger than 1,000 square feet or 35% of the floor area. However, City Council may approve a larger area as long as there are a couple of things sort of met. There's a couple of things we can look at to approve something larger than that without a variance. One of that is distance. So when we looked at here, that 38-foot distance between the nearest home, that 28-foot setback, that's sort of one of those standards. But then also the other part was buffering. So that's where that conversation with staff and the applicant came in, to looking for a way to really soften those views, to buffer them from that neighbor to the north. So with those, we felt that that did actually meet that standard that allows it for larger than 1,000 square feet. If some of those things hadn't been in place, if it was for, let's say, closer, if it was maybe right up to that setback line, that possibly would have been a reason to not support it. But based on those different factors, staff found it was appropriate to recommend approval, and then also that it met the standards.
Has the city calculated what percentage of the floor area is the proposed ADU and garage?
Yes. Commissioner Henry and Chair Sewell, the garage was not included in it since it's not part of how the staff looks at them for ADUs, the city, but it'd be just under 30%. So it does meet that 35% standard. It's the over 1,000 that it doesn't meet.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah, Commissioner Maxwell.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question that's very related to what Commissioner Henry was asking. The standard, it looks like, says that the total area must be 35, or should be 35% of the floor area of the principal dwelling, whereas the calculation that you gave, I believe, is of the total resulting structure, which includes the ADU. So it's never going to be less than 35%. It looks like it's closer to half of the principal, initial structure is what I mean by principal structure. Could you talk through how that calculation was actually made and whether I'm interpreting that correctly?
Sure. So the way we take it is you take the total structure, and in this case the garage was included because they could have built that garage without asking for it. So you take all of that amount and then you add in this number with it to make your total number. So it would be this new addition, this other one, and then you take just the addition to divide it by it. So to put it into perspective, the total here, and I'll do some quick math in my head, the existing structure is about 2,500 square feet. You'd add this 1,200 square feet on top of that, and you're about like 3,600 square feet or so. With that, the total would be 1,200, so it would be 1,200 divided by 3,600 gets you around that 30%, ballparking it in there. So it could be over again if this addition was even larger than this. It could exceed that 35%, but it doesn't based off how we calculated it. I think you had another question there. I apologize. I might have missed one.
I'm trying to understand what's the sort of the denominator in that percentage calculation. Is it the new structure with everything
correct.
Included? And so it's when it says in the standard the principal dwelling, I take that to mean what is the primary dwelling, and then this is the accessory to that. So when we wrote this standard, I seem to remember that we wanted the ADU to be sort of smaller than, less than, we said it had to be set behind the primary structure, smaller than the primary structure, and now it seems like this is being included in the floor area of what's being called the primary structure. Is that because it's attached, whereas if it was detached, would that be calculated separately?
No, I think we would have calculated the same way. Either way, we'd always include them together as the denominator as part of it, because it's looking at 35% of what's going to be there. Maybe that's an easier way of explaining it.
Not 35% of what existed
Exactly,
at the
correct.
beginning. Okay,
Yep, I
thank
apologize
you.
for that roundabout way for that.
Clarifies that for me.
And I
Thank
think just for reference too, this might look a lot bigger too on this picture, as this is a 1-story and this is a 2-story. So this house is actually double the size of what you're sort of seeing on your screen.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other questions? Yeah, Commissioner Banks.
Thanks, Chair. I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask just for the record. So it looks like there are, from the picture we're seeing now on our screen, 2 shared walls, and not quite sure the one, I guess, to the east there. what it's bumping up against. But is this a ADU because there's no entryway into the main home? Or what makes this a ADU versus just a renovation?
Sure. So when you're looking at ADUs, they're looking at what can really be a standalone living area. So in here, because it really, we have 3 criteria for that. First is a place to put down a bed, so it's sort of an easy one to usually hit. The second one is that you have another bathroom, but the third one is a kitchen. So if you have another kitchen that's being added, at that point, then it's really could be a standalone facility. Someone could live there without really being part of that other part of the house. So a lot of people might have a bathroom in their basement and larger area bedrooms. That's all fine. But as soon as you usually the trigger is a kitchen. When you have that, then it requires an ADU.
All right, thank you.
Good question. Anything else, commissioners? All right, I think we'll see if the applicant is here. Would like to make any comments or offer anything? Sure. Yeah. We'd love to hear from you. If you could give us your name and address for the record, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for meeting with us tonight. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm Pam, and this is my husband, Jeff. And thank you and appreciate you meeting with us tonight. We are getting older and know that we're not going to be able to live in our existing house forever because of all the stairs. And then we started thinking, okay, we love our neighborhood, we love our neighbors, we love being next to the school, we love the synagogue, we love the wetlands, we love all of it. And it's home. And with that in mind, we thought maybe we could still live there and build something that's accessible that we can move into as we get older. We talked with our daughter and her husband and young family, and they are interested in living in that house in the neighborhood as well. That would be the 3rd generation in my family that live in that house. So there's a lot of legacy. I know it doesn't have to do with the square footage and the percentages and everything, but it is part of the story. I actually, that's the only neighborhood I really remember living in, aside from when we first were married and had a family. We lived in Champlin, but I grew up on Hillside Lane, right across, like before Tanglin was built right there. Like I remember there being farm fields and it was a dirt road. So I kind of consider myself the neighborhood historian, self-proclaimed. But it is our home, and we would like to stay there and have something accessible to age into.
Part of the plan too is also that that my daughter and her husband, their family will own the property. Well, we're going to transfer it over, and then
they're going to buy it.
They'll buy it, and we're going to be then, spending our waning years as long as we can in this piece of property, or at this piece of property, and that's kind of where we're at. So we came up with a plan. We checked with the city, and, just went through the ADU process, and we came up with this, and we decided to keep it attached more to avoid building another wall, an additional wall to keep the cost down a little bit than for any particular reason. I don't know if that makes any difference. I do have the storage and the working area are also there because, well, we'd like to do things besides sit in the house and look out the window, also in our waning years. So I have a place for the e-bikes and whatever to stay. So that's kind of that. As far as the landscaping went, for one thing, we put that little bump in, if you will, between the garage storage area and the house, so we wouldn't have a straight wall kind of coming back to make it a little more attractive from the street. And then the landscaping kind of places some plants alongside the house and some plants in consultation with my neighbor to the north, because his house is exactly 10 feet away from the property line, and what we could do to make that more of a, make it better for him as well, for them as well. So that's kind of where we're at. Do you have any questions?
Great, thank you.
If I may ask.
Commissioners, any questions for the applicant? So it sounds like you did work with and speak with the neighbor to the north, because I remember when they came before the planning
Yes.
commission, when they were building, we had some discussion about
Yes.
where to slide the house. north or
Exactly.
north or south. So it sounds like you've had conversations with
We have.
with them.
Yep.
Wonderful.
They're on board.
That's not a must-have, but it sure is a nice to have.
Yeah.
and will
For
help.
whatever it's worth, the Tannenbaum Muggle Pines was his idea.
Okay, well, talk about collaboration.
So we've been working together. And his house actually comes down almost the length of the proposed construction that we're doing. It's probably about,
Yeah, it's
maybe 10
a bigger
feet.
new house, but it's
Yeah.
a story. Yep.
and it goes back quite a ways. So there isn't a huge
Okay,
difference.
great. Sounds good. We'll let you know if we have more questions.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you. All right, we'll open the public hearing. If anyone would like to come forward and comment on this item, feel free. Doesn't look like it. We'll close the public hearing. Commissioners, any final questions? Otherwise, we can just go to comments. What do we think? Who'd like to go first? Commissioner Waterman, you look like you're ready.
Thanks, Chair. I am very much in favor of this. I remember years ago when we were first looking at ADUs, I was a little bit hesitant, but the more stories I hear as people come forward and look to build them and look to stay in the city and look to have kind of multi-generational housing, the more and more impressed I am, and I'm excited about the opportunity to add more of that to the city. So very much in favor of this, in that there's a great story. It meets all the CUP standards and the setback requirements and the height standards, and sounds like no neighborhood opposition. It fits. I think it'll fit well within the city. I tend to like it when an ADU is actually attached to the existing structure. And so, I mean, that's a net positive for me. And noted about the 1,000 square foot, and that triggers some judgment here, being in excess of 1,000 square feet. But given all the points above, I don't think that's an issue for the neighborhood, and I think this will be a great project.
Great, thank you. Other comments? I'd like to go. Commissioner Henry, you look like you're ready.
Oh, sure. This is an absolute good. It's going to be good for the family. It's going to be good for the neighborhood, diversity of housing stock. And thanks for coming up and sharing your story. It makes it a lot more personal. And I think for us, sometimes we look at this and we're dispassionate about the numbers and things, but we have to remember that people are living here and this is where they make their life. So it really does help. So thanks a lot for doing that. And needless to say, I'm really in favor of this.
Sounds good. Thank you. Commissioner Banks, what are your thoughts?
Thanks, Chair. I'm in agreement with it as well. Seems like it's the right size for the ADU. Great how you incorporated it with the existing home and having it attached. Great that you work with the neighbors and you came up with a buffering plan for landscaping. I would say I'm not buying the fact that you guys are aging. You look pretty young to me, so maybe 20 years, 30 years from now. But I think you have a great place when you build this next to your home, and then to be close to family and hopefully grandkids and maybe even great grandkids. So good luck to you.
Other comments? Commissioner Minion?
I had a chance to drive it this morning, and obviously I wasn't looking at the plan when I drove the neighborhood, but I really like how you chose your architectural details and how it fits well with your neighbors. And again, I'm kind of echo some things we've heard. I'm really glad to hear that you're working with the city and that you're working with your neighbors, and I'm very much supportive of it. I particularly like the scale and how you arranged it and designed so that it was very pleasing from the street and still gives you plenty of space. So great job all the way around.
Great, thanks. Any comments, Commissioner Maxwell?
Yeah, I'll go next. This is exactly what the ADU ordinance is for. I feel like I'm pleased to see this type of ADU go in where you can have multi-generational housing, keep people housing in place on single level living, and given the size of this lot and the way this neighborhood is arranged and the design of this, I think the excess of 1,000 square feet is absolutely reasonable. So I'm glad to support this tonight.
Great, thanks. Any other final comments? Otherwise, I'll just offer mine quickly. Last year, I just moved from Cedarwood Ridge. I lived on there for 14 years, so I'm sorry we never met, or maybe we did and I don't remember. I apologize. So I've walked by it a million times, so I love, too, that some of the neighbors are remodeling and updating and adding on to their homes, so I think this fits right in. As long as the setbacks were met, I had no problems. They're met, so Hope everything goes well. Good luck with construction. You never know these days, so good luck with that. So it sounds like we're probably ready for a vote, and I think we're all going to be in favor, but let's see how we go. I'll wonder if someone wants to make a motion to approve conditional use permit for an accessory dwelling unit at 2211 Windsor Lake Drive. Would someone like to make that motion?
I'll make the motion, we approve.
Motion Banks.
I'll second.
Second Henry. Staff, please poll the commission.
Minion,
I agree. Approve.
Maxwell,
Yes.
Waterman,
Yes.
Banks,
Yes.
Henry,
Yes.
Chair Sewell.
Yes, motion carries. And this is a final decision by the Planning Commission. Is that correct, Ms. Thomas? Did I get that right? Or Drew?
Nope, this was a recommendation to City Council, so the City Council will be, have the final decision on that.
Got it. I'd put it on consent agenda, but for my 2 cents. So when's it going to be heard by the City Council?
Yeah, November 18th.
November 18th. All right. Good luck with the council, and good luck with your project. All right. Sorry, my agenda doesn't have the details of it, so that's my bad. All right. Next is item 8B, ordinance concerning cannabis retail business. Who's the lucky Ms. Thomas?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Sewell. As I noted in your written staff report, the state legislature approved in 2023 adult cannabis use in the state of Minnesota and a framework for regulating the cannabis market. Under that state law, cannabis businesses will all be licensed through the state of Minnesota, 13 different types of businesses, 13 different licensures. So the state will follow this process that's outlined on your screen. I won't go through that. Under the law, the city, and cities in general, cannot require separate licensure for cannabis businesses, and we can't prohibit cannabis businesses from operating in our community. And that includes putting in such stringent regulations into our zoning ordinance that effectively we don't allow businesses in our community. But under the state law, there are a few things that we can do. We can limit the number of retail businesses so long as there's one retail location allowed for every 12,500 people. So in the city of Minnetonka, that means we must allow 5 cannabis retail businesses. There's a whole other set of businesses that are more industrial type, and we'll talk about those in a minute. The city can require those retail facilities to register with our community, and we can establish minimum buffers from cannabis businesses to other types of land uses. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit. City staff has put together actually 3 ordinances to ensure that we are complying with state law and that we're using those authorities that are given to us under the law to regulate businesses here. The one ordinance that you don't see on the screen is the public use ordinance, and that is something that is the purview really of the city council and the park board. So that's a whole separate thing that we won't be talking about this evening. But the 2 ordinances we will talk about are the zoning ordinance, which is certainly your purview. Like all other zoning related matters, you'll make a recommendation to the city council on the ordinance amendment we present to you. And then the second ordinance we're going to talk about is the retail registration ordinance. This ordinance is not within the zoning ordinance, it's rather within our licensing ordinance. If you think about liquor licenses, tobacco licenses, body art licenses, not something that this body has authority over, but there are 2 components of the retail registration ordinance that are locationally based. And so the council, when they heard the introduction, said, we want the Planning Commission's input on these location components. So first, we'll talk about the zoning ordinance amendment. As I said, there's 13 different types of cannabis businesses that will be licensed by the state. They're on the left-hand side of this chart. And those 13 different types of businesses would generally fall within our existing zoning classifications and zoning framework. And they would fall in there because our zoning ordinance is general. We talk about general uses, and what I mean is that from a zoning perspective, a retailer is a retailer is a retailer. We don't distinguish between a liquor store, a pet supply store, a shoe store. The zoning ordinance sees all of those as stores. Liquor stores need a liquor license, but again, that's not zoning based. That's something in our licensure ordinance. Similarly, manufacturing businesses are allowed in industrial districts, whether you're manufacturing car parts or dog food, you're manufacturing something. So because our ordinance is general, the changes that are proposed by staff are primarily intended to provide some clarity under the state law. We have 4 changes or amendments we're proposing. The first is in our residential district, and it regulates or refers to commercial agriculture. Under our existing ordinance, and many people don't know this, commercial agriculture is allowed on residentially zoned parcels. So someone could grow potatoes commercially in their backyard, or buy a vacant property and grow sweet corn on that vacant property for commercial sale. Under the existing ordinance, staff is proposing that cannabis cultivation for commercial purposes be specifically excluded from that commercial agriculture. Cultivation for private use on residential property is allowed under state law and would continue to be, obviously, in the city. The second change is then the addition of cannabis retail businesses as a permitted use within our commercial districts, which are PID, B2, and B3. And even though we talk about retail generally, we want the ordinance to refer to the retail registration ordinance. So that's why we're calling out cannabis businesses subject to the retail registration ordinance. We're adding that, or proposing to add that language to our commercial districts. Similarly, putting that same language for cannabis retail businesses and referring to the registration ordinance in our industrial districts. We do allow retail in the industrial districts as accessory or conditional uses, depending on the square footage of that retail already. And then cannabis cultivators, manufacturers, and wholesalers would simply be allowed as permitted uses under our existing language. We're suggesting adding testing as a general allowance within the industrial district. So that is kind of the zoning amendment that the Planning Commission is being asked to consider and recommend approval of this evening. Jumping then into the retail registration ordinance, and I'm going to do this presentation, but Ms. Wishnak, please jump in if I make a mistake here. So we're also proposing a retail registration ordinance. Again, up to 5 retailers could be registered within the city of Minnetonka. The ordinance, as it's proposed, outlines that applications for registration would be accepted by our licensing division. It's one of the many divisions that fall under the Community Development Director's umbrella. Those registration applications would be reviewed in the order in which they're received, with one exception, which we'll talk about. And then Ms. Wishnak would issue registrations essentially for the first 5 compliant applicants. All other applicants would then be officially denied. And I need to really emphasize we're talking about retailers here, not the industrial uses. So the 2 components of the retail registration ordinance that the council is looking for your input on are a locational in nature. One is what we're calling the PID preference, and the other is a buffer requirement. As I mentioned, these registration applications would be reviewed in the order that they're received. However, staff is suggesting in the ordinance that applications for locations in the PID district, which as you know runs along the 394 corridor, that those would be given preference. Put another way, those locations would jump to the front of the review line. That doesn't mean that all 5 retailers would be in the PID district. We don't know what applications we'll receive. Perhaps there will be 10 applications in the PID district, perhaps there will be none. But it's staff's opinion that locations in that district would be preferable, as the highest concentration of commercially guided properties are already in that district. And properties, I'm going to jump forward a little bit here, properties that are in the B2 or B3 commercial district tend to be in smaller retail nodes in our community. So think Glen Lake, think Cedar Hills Shopping Center, which is on Cedar Lake Road, just west of the high school. Think the 7 High area. Those are B2 and B3 areas. Typically, these smaller areas are surrounded by low-density residential. So the first question then for the commission is, what are your thoughts on this PID preference within the registration ordinance? The second locational standard relates to buffers. Under the state law, the city can require separation between cannabis businesses and schools, daycares, residential care facilities, or park features that are regularly used by minors. Again, I need to emphasize not parks, not the property on which a park is located, but the actual feature within the park that is regularly used by minors. So an athletic field, a playground, something like that. The proposed registration ordinance, we have included the buffer standard for schools and parks, but we've intentionally left out the buffer for daycares and residential care facilities. Those facilities, whether it's a daycare or a care facility, that serve 6 or fewer clients are permitted in our residential areas. The city has no review authority over those. They can begin operation with our approval, and quite frankly, often do even without our knowledge. So a cannabis retailer could occupy a space that meets all buffers one day and then become non-conforming the next day if a daycare or a care facility moves in. Again, that would more likely occur in a smaller residential, or excuse me, a smaller commercial node, but that certainly could happen. And so that's why we've intentionally not included daycares and care facilities in our suggested language. Just the administration of that would be very difficult. So your second question is then, what are your thoughts on leaving out those buffers? We also are not suggesting that buffers be applied to the industrial type cannabis businesses. So the manufacturer, the wholesaling, those types of businesses are already allowed in our industrial district, and we don't apply buffers to other businesses, which we think would have equal impacts, if you will, to cannabis industry. So the third question is, what are your thoughts on buffers for industrial type businesses? And then lastly, staff has included all of these buffer requirements in the registration ordinance rather than the zoning ordinance, again intentionally, to tie the buffer requirement to the registration rather than to the site. I had to think through this quite a bit. This was tough, and we spoke with some other communities about how they were going to do this buffer requirement, and I think an example is the best way to describe it. If a new daycare, let's say a cannabis business starts operation in a strip mall, and it begins its perfectly conforming. And the next day, a daycare moves into the tenant space right next door in that same strip mall. The cannabis business would become non-conforming, or regardless of where the buffer requirement sits. But if the buffer requirement is in the registration ordinance, that non-conforming use goes away when that retailer ceases to operate, because the next retailer will have to register with the city. And when the city looks through its registration ordinance, it will see, oh, you can't go in that space because you're too close to a daycare. But if the buffer requirement were in the zoning ordinance, non-conforming use rights would not go away when that retailer vacated the space, because under land use law, the space would have to be actually vacant of cannabis retailing for 12 months before that non-conforming use right went away. So a new retailer could propose to go in there, and Julie would be obligated, if it was one of 5, to approve that because of the non-conforming use rights that sit in the zoning ordinance. And that's not based on Minnetonka's non-conforming use ordinance. That's state non-conforming use ordinance. So we just thought that it was a better idea to tie the buffer to the registration. It gets connected to the retailer versus to the space. That one is kind of a little bit of a brain meld.
The only thing I would add, Susan, is in your example, you give daycares, but we're not putting that in the ordinance. So if you flip back one, just go back one slide. So
park
just take
feature,
that and use a park or a school.
A school.
Use that as your buffer instead of the daycare.
Good idea. Thank you. So I made it even more confusing by throwing daycares in there. Sorry. So that's really the last question. Do you have any thoughts on buffer requirement in the zoning ordinance versus the registration ordinance? I would only say that if the city chooses to apply buffers to all cannabis businesses, the buffer requirement would have to be in the zoning ordinance because we're only registering retailers. That's all we're allowed to register. We can't register the people who are cultivating cannabis plants indoors in an industrial district. So therefore, we couldn't apply a buffer to them unless the buffer requirement were in the zoning ordinance. I hope I haven't confused you with this. We've been thinking about this for at least 6 months, and it's been very confusing for us to get through this, so I apologize if I have. So tonight, really, what we're asking of you is first, and the easy one that you guys are used to dealing with, is what do you think about the zoning amendment proposed by staff? And you will make a recommendation on that. And then the next 4 questions are really just your conversation and thoughts on the PID preference, the buffers not applying to daycares or licensed residential care facilities, the buffer requirement being in the zoning ordinance versus registration ordinance, and then buffers applied to industrial type businesses. And I'll turn it back to you. Unless, Julie, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think that the only thing I would add, Susan, is it has been a lot of work, and you've done a great job of trying to synthesize what has kind of culminated in 6 months here. But I also think it's important to understand that every city's a little bit different, but we're all following the state guidance in the state guidance book that was prepared for all the cities. So what you see in especially the zoning amendments, all of that closely follows the model ordinance. So I just want you to be assured that that was part of the consideration.
All right, great, thank you. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm actually going to lean on you. Please keep us on track, not in terms of time, but in terms of we will inevitably drift off of the path that we need to be on, and just out of our natural curiosity. So if you can say that's not part of your purview, that's fine, but just please help us stay on track. But actually having these questions to answer is a big help, I think, for us. So with that, commissioners, do we have any questions? If so, run it.
Chair, just procedurally, for
Please.
the zoning amendment, we will have to open a public hearing for
Yeah, I
the
will.
zoning amendment.
Yep,
Okay.
but I want to ask questions first, and then I'll open up the public hearing because it may answer questions. And then also, just real quick, Commissioner Hanson will not be here.
Oh, thank you for letting us know.
I told him we had 6 people, and he can just
Okay.
stay home. So, just from a attendance standpoint. So, all right, commissioners. Looks like Commissioner Banks is ready to go.
Questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just a couple of questions. Great presentation. Really understood everything that you were laying out here for us to consider. I just want to be clear. So the 5 total for the retail, is that whether or not it's in a retail district or industrial district? Is it 5 total?
That's correct, Commissioner Banks. It's 5 total, whether they're retailers or they're a retail component of an industrial district. I should also note, because I didn't want to add extraneous stuff in here, but there's a difference between retailers that are just selling cannabis products versus some places who already in town are selling low potency hemp-derived products, gummies essentially, or THC that's in beer at the breweries in town. Those retailers we're calling a secondary retailer. So if you can buy a gummy at the gas station, that doesn't count towards one of the 5 places. We have more than 5 places that are selling those products already in town.
Okay.
The retailing, the 5 retailers is cannabis retailing. The primary retail is cannabis.
Okay. Thanks for clearing that up. My next question then, is there a plan for if and when our population changes, if it goes more and we can have 6, or if, hopefully it doesn't happen, but population goes down, and is there a plan in place to not be stuck at on the total 5?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Banks, that number will fluctuate, and that's something that we'll have to evaluate as a state demographer updates our population. My guess is that 12,500 people, that's going to take a couple of years for us to get up to that, but we will certainly, absolutely, at the time of the census, have to adjust, and potentially if we see trends from given to us by the state demographer, we'll have to adjust that too. Because again, to comply with the state law, we have to adjust upward or downward based on that 12,500 number.
Okay.
Would you say, Susan, though, it would be mandatory to adjust upwards? It is not mandatory to go downward.
Correct.
So if your population does increase, obviously that's a mandatory thing. But if it decreases, we could still have 5.
That's a good
Doesn't
point.
matter. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Next question about the daycares. I know we have a lot of facilities that are daycares that house more than 6 kids. Like a home could be a daycare. Does that fall under the purview of a school, or is that still considered a daycare that would be excluded?
That would still be considered a daycare, Commissioner Banks and Chair Sewell, under the ordinance. So that would be something to consider if you wanted to treat daycares that are what we call conditionally permitted. If you have more than 6 folks being cared for, you need a conditional use permit for that type of use.
Okay. And then I think my last question here, I think you answered it, but just the facilities that are industrial, but they have a store or they have a retail component to them, those we would actually consider in this ordinance as well. Okay.
Correct, yep.
All right, thank you.
Real quick before we go on to other commissioners, just as a piggyback, is the 5 the minimum required or the maximum allowed?
Chair Sewell,
Okay.
it's the, under the state law, it's the minimum required.
Sure.
The council, and correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, the council has suggested that we will allow the minimum
They'll f-
required. That will be our maximum.
They'll follow
Yeah.
the state. Okay, that's what I figured, but I just didn't know if that was where that was coming. Okay. Thank you. Commissioners.
And if I could just clarify one more time. When we say the minimum required, we're not required to have 5 retailers. We're
Allowed.
required to allow
Yes,
5
that's what-
retailers.
yeah.
Yep.
We just got lazy and left off the last word, but I was tracking. Commissioners, other questions? Commissioner Henry, you have some questions?
Sure do, thank you. Can you talk about the lower potency hemp and edible retailers? Are those under the purview of any of the state laws that are passed recently? Do they have to register?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, licensure is required
And yes,
at the state level, but they are not required to register with the city of Minnetonka.
Correct. The only caveat I know we have lots of stipulations to our answers tonight, but there are occasionally people who sell low potency hemp products, but also sell tobacco or electronic delivery devices, which would throw them into a tobacco license with the city. So it just depends on what kind of products they're selling and whether or not they need a different kind of license from the city.
But the city has no authority to limit the number of low potency retailers in the city, is that correct?
We have the authority to, we have chosen not to do it. We have chosen not to have more regulation. The council, was it 3 years ago when low potency hemp came out? I'm going from memory here. They chose not to regulate or have licensing standards for those types of businesses when that was allowed. Now that the new laws are in effect, no longer can the city do that, and you'd have to go through the state. So there was a period of time we could have, but we didn't.
Has the city council thought about opening up that discussion again too, now that the conditions have changed?
The discussion about regulating those businesses differently,
Yep.
they did not indicate that that was something they wanted to do. Not at the last meeting that we were with them, no.
Okay. With the registration potentially of max of 5 applicants for retail, what's to prevent people from coming in and poaching all those 5 licenses? I'm assuming there's some rigorous process where you have to show that you're a viable candidate for a retailer and not just to go up and buy up all the licenses and then to sell those licenses at a higher price.
You mean someone like monopolizing and literally procuring one group, procuring all of the licenses in the city? Is that what you're?
Oh, sure, yeah. The
I just don't
classic,
know what you mean by poaching.
yeah, the classic example would be somebody buys up an internet domain because they know that it's going to be popular soon, and then they're holding
Got it,
on to it,
okay.
and then they're going to sell it to the highest
Got it.
bidder.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying.
So Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, again, all of the licensing is done at the state of Minnesota. I don't know what the state requirements are as to if one entity, how many licenses that one entity can hold. I don't know what the state requirements are. From a registration perspective, we would be reviewing applicants in the order that they're received. And that was direction or conversation at the council level, that's how that would occur. And Julie, I can't recall, but from a licensure perspective, people are currently able to apply for licensure at the state, but licenses have not been granted as of yet. That will be in January, I believe.
Not quite, almost. The social equity applicants
Yes.
were allowed to apply. No one else has been able to apply at this point. So until they get everything set up, and in fact, even the social equity applicants, even though they've applied, they don't know if they have licensing yet. They allowed them to apply, but there's not a physical license that they hold at this time.
Maybe this is beyond our purview, but if those applicants, then future applicants, when it's opened up to everybody, when they apply for licensure, does that automatically have them apply for registration in the city of Minnetonka? Is part of their licensure saying, I want to register for a retail in this specific locality?
The licensure from the state, so what will happen is the applicants apply for a license from the state. The state vets those applicants for the state requirements, and they do background checks. Then they send to the city what's called a zoning confirmation. So those folks that have applied for licensure through the state of Minnesota have to have a location in mind, specific tenant space that they want to operate in. The state reaches out to city planning staff and says, does this location meet your zoning requirements? And we say yes or no. Then that goes back to the state. They do a site inspection and they issue the license. So in some ways, yes, they have to, when they go to the state, have to identify where they hope to be located. I'm not sure if, does that answer your question?
The other, going back to your earlier question about can somebody just go and get a lot of licenses, right? And say they want to take up all of Minnetonka. They would have to have locations identified. So I suppose, I mean, hypothetically, sure, somebody could set up an LLC and get a lease with a building and then decide later that they don't want it and give it to someone else. I mean, I suppose that, but that next business would then have to get, so it's not like they can just transfer it, you know, their approvals. So then, the LLC that got the license can't just sell it to another LLC for the highest bidder, as you were sharing, because that next bidder would have to go to the state and get reapproved, new license.
And they'd be
Make
put
sense? Yeah,
more or less, and they'd be put at the end of the line,
here, locally.
and also at the state.
No.
If somebody
No.
applied.
No. Mm-mm. State's different. Licensing, registration, different.
But if somebody had no experience doing any licensure for the state, and then the company A wanted to transfer to company B, but company B hadn't applied for licensure, they would have to do so, and then they would be at the end of the state's line for licensure.
I don't think the state, I don't know that that description is accurate. There's no line at the state. There's a line here, not at the state. Applications come in, they're processed. License. It's not like there's only so many licenses at the state.
Yeah, Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, they would just, the new applicant would simply be a new applicant at the state. And how the state processes those applications, I guess we don't know.
It's not in order like it's not a timestamp like we're doing here for the 5.
And since some people were allowed to apply for licensure now, has the city done research to find if there has been people that want to register in a specific building in Minnetonka?
We have not heard anything from anybody who wants to. Now, we've heard from people who are looking. No one who has actually had licensing at the state as a social equity applicant. I have not heard from anybody.
If they did apply, would the city be notified that there is a license that was potentially for a location in Minnetonka?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, under the state regulations, they would have to get approval
Mandatory.
from us. So as part of their licensure process, again, they have to get zoning approval from us. Right now, we don't have a zoning ordinance that deals with cannabis businesses. And so we couldn't give that zoning approval, which is why kind of we're trying to be a little bit ahead of the game so that we can, if
By the
there are
18th, yeah.
if there are social equity applicants, that they can apply here in the city. But as of right now, we simply don't have an ordinance that allows for cannabis retailers because we don't have a registration ordinance. So
Kind of a circular.
yeah, it's kind of a circular question at this point.
You said to be ahead of the curve, the city's trying to put together an ordinance now. Is the state law, did the state require cities to put these ordinances in by a certain date? And they're holding off the licensure notifications
No.
to the cities until that date?
No. No. They are not.
When you say no, that means that they could share the information with you now? If somebody had applied for licensure
Yeah.
in Minnetonka?
Chair Sula and Commissioner Henry, if someone applies for a license from the state has to contact the city. They have to send this, and we haven't been contacted yet.
Okay, so implying that nobody has applied for licensure in the city of Minnetonka?
Correct.
Okay, yeah, that's clear.
This slide really helps understand the process because I think it's really helpful
Yeah,
to
and
understand.
it's very similar to other things that the state interacts with the city on. It's actually pretty close to how liquor licensing is done. Like, the city can't issue a license. Now, this is licensing, not registration, but it's a similar issue. If the state hasn't gone out and inspected the facility and they don't have the state license, we as a city can't issue the license and allow occupancy. So it's the same check and balance. So it to me, it's, I know for the planning commission, they might not see some of this because you're not involved in licensing, but for me, it's very familiar territory, how this works, in terms of the notification and how that happens.
So licenses are done at the state level. Registration is done at the
Right.
local level.
Correct. For this, for cannabis.
Yes, for cannabis. And then what level of scrutiny is registration based on, right? The state's doing the background checks, right, to see.
Not much. There's not much registration scrutiny. no.
Okay. So it's basically like, have you gone through the state process and I assume
Is the zoning right? Is
yeah,
the-
so basically like, are they selecting a location that fits within what we're talking about tonight, our zoning,
Correct.
right?
True.
Okay. All right, sorry, I'm just trying to wrap my head around it, so I didn't mean to derail, I just wanted
Yeah, it takes a while.
clarification too, so.
Thank you.
All yours.
Next question, you said the city council decided that they wanted to do the minimum number of retailers that are allowed by state law. Did also the city council decide about the 1,000-foot, 500-foot buffer between schools and parks respectively?
No, Chair and Commissioner Henry, no. That was one of the questions that they're asking for input from you all. The city does not have to require buffers. We don't have to require buffers. We're allowed to under the law.
And the law also says that we can't have buffers that would essentially zone out retailers.
Correct.
So I was wondering if the city had done homework to find that 1,000-foot, 500-foot seems to be a happy medium where you would think about the interest in public safety, but you would also try to make it not impossible for retailers to come up with sites.
Chair and Commissioner Henry, we did, and I apologize, the more I look at this map, it may be a little bit confusing, but I'm going to zoom in. So we did several GIS exercises looking at the schools in our community and then the parks in our community. So what you're seeing here are all of the schools in the city of Minnetonka, whether they're public, private, charter, so all of the schools, and the 1,000-foot buffer is in the blue. The blue, I don't have a mouse here, but the blue circles are the 1,000-foot buffer. Then, thanks, Julie. Then we also took park features, and we at first had all of the parks in our community on this map, and you couldn't really see anything else. So what we did is we took just those parks that are in proximity to commercially zoned property and applied the 500-foot buffer. So we only have 4 shown, 2 south of Highway 7 and then 2 north of 394. So obviously far more parks in our community. Then we removed from this map, There was a lot more yellow on this map before, but we removed from this map the yellow are retail areas or commercially zoned areas. We removed any of those properties that were within those buffers. So what you're left with are the yellow highlights on this map are properties where a retailer could go in our community. So we felt that the 1,000-foot buffer, based on this exercise, we felt that those numbers that are called out in the statute, the 1,000 feet and the 500 feet, did leave adequate commercially zoned properties for retailers, for the 5 retailers in our community.
So just to clarify, that was city doing their homework and then making a presentation to the city council to say, here's what we think is reasonable?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, yes, staff doing our homework, and then as we do presenting an ordinance that we felt at the ordinance introduction was appropriate. So we presented these buffers because we felt they were appropriate. I don't recall that there was any conversation on the buffer distance at the council level.
I know it's probably not reasonable to ask this, but in the packet, it would be nice if they could have some more GIS maps to show larger buffers than what this is, potentially 1,500 feet or 1,000 feet from park features. I know you can't do that now, but since we're tasked with commenting on the size of the buffer, it would be good to see some visual maps with that.
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, we can certainly put together some more maps, maybe zooming in. The city actually can't apply a greater buffer than what is in state statute. So we couldn't, for instance, say we want 5,000 feet from schools. We can only, the maximum we can apply is what we're showing here.
Oh, okay. I wasn't aware that state
Yeah.
said these are the maximums.
I apologize, I should have been more specific on that.
Well, then you can negate my last request.
Any other questions, or?
No, I'm
you ready
good for
to
now.
move?
Thank
Okay,
you.
Great. Other questions by commissioners? Commissioner Minion, did you have one?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Just real quick, just a couple of questions that
All
came
fresh.
up, and I just checked the state's website for informational purposes. When you apply for a license, you do have to know the location where you want to put the retail. And then second thing I saw is that you can transfer a license.
Cannot.
You can, yes.
Not here, not in Minnetonka. You wouldn't be able to.
right.
Okay.
At the
I just
state
wanna-
level.
You can't transfer that. Okay. I just want to be clear for.
Commissioner Minion, you have a question?
First off, you guys have kind of picked on yourselves, but I think you've done a wonderful job. I appreciate all you've done. Lots of good thought has gone into this. I'm going to ask one of my famous dumb questions, and my heart's kind of like, how do we protect the kids? But will you tell me what the definition of a school is? And where I'm going with this question is you've done a good job of talking about schools, we've done a good job of talking about daycares, but there's those intermediate size things like math class in retail places, there's dance class, and there's a large number of children there. Do they fall into anything, or are they looked at at all in this?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Minion, I probably should have the city attorney here to answer that, but I think the intent of the state statute is that it's a school like we would think of a school, not somewhere that simply has classes for specific subjects. So not your tutoring type places, not the dance class, but it's a school that would meet essentially the state regulations for Department of Education.
I don't think we have any schools in retail locations, right? Some of those other places usually fall in retail locations, right?
Correct. Those types of tutoring locations would fall probably, Chair, in more of a retail facility.
That's kind of where I'm going. And just, if nothing else, hopefully kind of get some juices flowing, or a little bit of thought in that, either on our level or hopefully in the state level. it sounds like that 1,000-foot, 500-foot is a state mandate. Is the 500, would it be simpler to say 1,000-foot across the board, or are both of those mandated by the state?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Minion, those numbers are very specific in the state allowances. We can do 1,000 feet from a school and 500 feet from daycares, park features, and residential care facilities. And those are the only uses we can apply a buffer to, and those are the only buffers we can apply.
Or less.
Or less, correct, or none.
Or not at all.
Or none.
Not at
Which
all.
is what we're talking about here tonight.
Okay. We talked about the industrial applications. Has anybody talked about the hazards of just what that means? Is there anything that would be emitted from an industrial application? Is there anything that would have impact in people walking by or people not in a buffer around there? And I know that's a really hard question to ask tonight, and I'm just wondering what would that look like in regards to somebody walking by and being exposed to anything?
Chair and Commissioner Minion, I wouldn't profess to know all of those regulations. However, the PCA the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency would regulate any manufacturing or any kind of facility that's emitting something into the air. So there's air quality standards and air regulations that apply to any business like that. And I don't have the rules off the top of my head specific to hemp. I don't think it says hemp or cannabis. It's about what kind of particulates are you emitting into the air. So it can be for any kind of business that does that.
So we could assume that it would be generally, if they met those EPA essentially rules, that it would be safe.
Correct.
Okay. And then one last thing, I think we talked a little bit, I really like how you separated out the daycares and stuff, but what would backpedaling or changing things do in regards to how we handle things if we had the cannabis retailer already in place and then that childcare came in next to it? We kind of touched on that a little bit, but we talk a little bit about how that kind of that day two or a grandfather would look like.
Yeah, Chair Sewell and Commissioner Minion, and this would be similar to any use in our community that's established under a certain regulation and then something changes. That retail facility would become non-conforming. That doesn't mean it needs to close down. It doesn't mean that the registration is revoked or that the license is revoked. It just becomes non-conforming, and it can continue to operate as is for however long it operates. At the point that it closes, the retail facility were to close, and by close I mean vacate the space, then what would happen is if the buffer requirement is under the registration ordinance, a new applicant tries to register with the city and wants to go in that space, they wouldn't be allowed to because now there would be a school next door. If the buffer requirement were in the zoning ordinance and a new retailer tried to register, say, within 6 months of the vacation, we would be obligated to allow that because non-conforming use rights under zoning only sunset after the use hasn't existed for 12 months.
So effectively you're saying is we have more control in the end to be a little forgiving as businesses come and go in the way the way it's proposed instead of putting it into zoning is what you're saying?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Minion, I think planners and my colleagues can correct me if you disagree. We're always looking for ways to not cause non-conforming uses in the future because they really are really difficult to deal with once they become non-conforming. There's just all sorts of things that go on with those. So whatever we can do to prevent non-conformity, we try to do from the very beginning.
I appreciate the write-up about the 900 foot and the 1,000 foot. That was really helpful. Just kind of want to bring that out. Thank you for your time.
Could you please bring up the questions that we need to answer? Other questions? Right, I'm just going to go then.
That's
Um,
okay, Chair. I have one more.
You got another one? Go
Yeah,
ahead.
just to follow up on Commissioner Minion's questions, that's all predicated on that we do have the daycare in the buffer. His question, and right now the city is recommending that we don't include that or residential care in our comments because it's difficult to administer. Is that what I'm understanding?
Yeah, Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, correct. We are suggesting that daycares and residential care facilities do not have a buffer applied to them. But schools would continue to have a buffer in our proposal, and playgrounds, ball fields, things like that would continue to have a buffer, park facilities and schools. So, and I started this by using a daycare as an example, but if a school were to go in, a retail facility could become non-conforming. If the city decided to put in a playground equipment within 400 feet of a cannabis retailer, the retailer could become non-conforming. So,
But in that story, if we do tie the registration to the retail ordinance, it's tied to the space. So then if they would vacate, then potentially there'd be less non-conforming issues for the city versus if they were tied to the zoning.
correct.
Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So then also clarifying, then the city's asking us to talk about, give our preference about whether we should or should not include daycares and other care facilities in this buffer.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Commissioner Waterman, Commissioner Maxwell, questions? Okay, Commissioner Waterman.
I have several. Thank you. And I agree. I follow along with what we're saying. So it's actually well laid out as much as, though there's so much content. All right. In no particular order. So using the example of we're evaluating whether we might disagree and maybe recommend that the 500-foot buffer around a daycare would be in place. So my question is, like, if there were a registration application and were to check all the boxes, but there's like clearly a large daycare right there, does the city have any ability then to apply and be like, to say, hey, like, we're not trying to ice everyone out, but this might not be the right location? Does that make sense?
If you have that regulation, yes, the city could say,
If you have the regulation, but if not,
if you didn't,
then you
absolutely
have to,
not.
it checks the boxes. Okay.
You would have
Thank you.
compliance.
Are you able to summarize any online feedback? I mean, I imagine this was on Minnetonka Matters. Like, has there been engagement?
I'm sure no feedback's been given, right, Julie?
It's interesting. I was expecting some interaction on Minnetonka Matters. People haven't been commenting, so I know.
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Waterman and Ms. Wishnak, would you say that there was more commentary on the public use side of things? About a year ago,
Yeah,
we had
I saw lots of
a booth
Yes,
at the
for sure.
Yeah.
at the open house, at the citywide open house, and asked for feedback on the public use component.
Right.
So there's been feedback on that. That
Lots of feedback,
yeah.
if I recall, right?
and that's
True.
That's what I was
Not
joking
on
about.
so use of a chair, if I may. Sorry.
Please.
Use of marijuana or cannabinoid products in city facilities or city property. Definitely got feedback on that. Not so much on ordinances.
Great, thanks. So to confirm, it's kind of sort of a two-part question. Ridgedale is in the PID, and could that at all be excluded, carved out, factored in, or it's just the PID is the PID?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Waterman, under the zoning ordinance, it's the PID district is the PID district is the PID district.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Confirming, despite, I mean, this discussion here, it's not like each of these would come before the Planning Commission. It's all through each registration application.
Correct. Staff is suggesting in the registration ordinance that the registrations be done administratively through the community development licensing, and then Ms. Wishnak as the community development director. I had a sense from the council that they were very comfortable with that under the law. either retailer's registration can be approved administratively, or it can be approved by the council. I didn't have any sense that the council was interested in that.
Okay, thank you. Let me know if this is too far out of scope. Are there other items that are licensed at the state in a similar way where there's a minimum required? Like you have to allow for X number of liquor stores?
mandating.
Guns, liquor, tobacco, that type of thing.
Yeah.
I'm thinking. There is some historical context on liquor. If you look up statutory cities of the first class, we are not. There are some parameters by population about how many liquor stores to allow. So there's some. It's a pretty old law, but it is out there and does provide some context for how this. I think that's how they started talking about population and number of establishments. Cities, even if they're not a class 1 city, you will see that in. We have it in our policy, not in our ordinance, about how many liquor stores in the city. So similar concept.
Yeah, no, thanks. I just wasn't sure if it was state level. Again, I didn't want to get too far out of our purview. Back to the daycares, and sort of mentioned the concept of not having buffers generally because of the administrative burden for daycares. But then you brought up conditionally permitted daycares. It's an interesting thread to pull. Have you evaluated, is that a little bit more manageable if that were the administrative standard, such that if it were within 500 feet of a conditionally permitted, I'm opening to like what the rules are, but
Chair
Daycare.
Sewell and Commissioner Waterman, we haven't done that GIS exercise, but it would be one that could easily be done because, again, we know where the conditionally permitted daycares are because we granted the conditional use permit. So that would be something that we could easily run, and also something that we could easily look up at the time of a registration. Versus just so that you know, occasionally staff will have to run a report from the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services just to see where all of the daycares are. And I say see, but it's just a list of daycare facilities and residential care facilities, because we don't know where they are in town unless we run that list. And that's a bit time consuming. But and ever changing, correct. But the conditionally permitted things, that would be something that would be relatively easy for staff.
okay, it might be something more for the council, just because we're not deciding on that part of it tonight, but maybe they would find that informative. I think I had one more here. Forgive me. I did just have to ask, where is it? I'm sure I'll get to this in comments, but I did talk to a bunch of people. People were asking, like, what if the city really pushes back against the state? If there is just opposition to having retail cannabis in the city. So I'm just curious, what? And I know I'm like outside the bounds here, but like, it's just, lawsuit, that's it. And,
That's interesting.
yeah.
You fight the
guess-
state,
Yeah.
essentially?
Chair, I don't know that I want to be in that position, but
Oh.
I don't know. I'm not sure what they would do.
That's a question for the city attorney, probably.
Yeah.
I'm sure she could rattle off a whole host of.
No, this is new territory. I mean, I think no one's tried to do that, so I don't know that we have precedence. So, as you said before, there's not really any situation where the state's requiring cities to do certain things like this. And so, how they would enforce that, I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Any other questions? Yeah, Commissioner Banks, you have another question?
Just one question. Is the state prohibiting companies who are getting licenses from being able to do two different types of businesses, and how would that be managed if they can? I don't have an example,
You know,
but like,
Like if
Chair
Target
and
started selling?
well, maybe if you want to do a liquor store and also a cannabis store, like,
Commissioner Banks, there are all kinds of, on those, is it 15 types of license? 13 types of licenses. There are all kinds of parameters depending on which license you're talking about. So on I'm just going to pick one here. I'm going to go on on a retailer. So here's the answer to your question, Commissioner Henry. License type is available in limited quantities, and licensees will be selected through a vetted lottery. A cannabis retailer may operate up to 5 retail locations. However, no person, cooperative, or business may hold a license to own or operate more than 1 cannabis retail business in 1 city and 3 in 1 county. So that's an example of, but each one has their own list of, so I don't want to bore you with all that, but it's complicated.
Sounds complicated, but thank you. That answers the question.
Could you real quick turn to the PID slide that you had, please? I think, was there one on just the PID? Was there a slide that outlined what the question or was around the PID question that we need to answer?
The question, Chair Sewell, regarding the PID is, again, we're suggesting that registration applications be reviewed in the order that they're received, except that locations in the PID will be given preference. So again, an example is if Ms. Wishnak were to receive 10 applications in one day, they would all be time-stamped. And she would review them in the order that they're received, except that if there's one that came in 7th and it was in the PID district, it would be moved to the top of the list. So it would be reviewed first.
Okay.
So that's the question about the PID. Should locations in the PID be given preference, or should we just eliminate that clause from the ordinance and just say, we'll review the applications in the order that they're received?
Okay. And then using your example, when there are 10, right, and we only have 5, are you just approving the first 5, or do you look at all of the 10 and then decide? It's a nuance, but
It would have to, all of the applications would have to be complete and compliant to be accepted. So let's just say application number 3 didn't have the right materials or didn't have the right information.
Then they're out.
Or they're disqualified because they're not in the right area. They're not in the right zoning district or something. That could be a disqualification. It would be denied.
But if there were 7 qualified, then you just will
Just in the
choose-
order.
So and you would review all of them. Okay,
All of them.
got it. And then what's the recommendation, or why would we prioritize the PID?
Chair and Commission, in staff's opinion, there's, I'm just going to zoom in here, or actually that's too far.
It's the large commercial center,
It's the
obviously.
largest, the most commercial properties are within that district. And in these smaller commercial nodes, they're generally closer to lower density residential
Yep.
districts, whereas in the PID district, certainly there are lower density residential areas, but the commercial centers are typically further away, or the commercial buildings are typically further away from that low density area.
I'm going to ask you to do probably one of your least favorite things is speculate. I know you haven't had them come in yet, but do you think naturally you'll see an outsized portion in the PID?
I'll start, and
Or-
Ms. Wishnak can
And
answer.
I won't hold you to this. I just want your opinion or best guess.
It is an interesting question, and I think that one that staff has thought about a lot. In one case, it's a regional center. There's a lot of traffic in that area.
Yeah.
So for a retailer, from a retail perspective, that would be a great location, no matter what you're selling, to be in that district. The flip side is, because of all of those things, probably the highest rent per square foot. And so maybe not, especially if you're
profitable
just,
maybe, yeah.
if you're just starting as a retailer, maybe that isn't a location that you necessarily can afford, and so you're looking in a, so I don't have a crystal ball, but I would think that we'll get applications for all of the districts.
No, I do too. I mean, I think that you will have other neighborhood centers as an attractive, usually in a, I think of these things as in a strip mall
Most likely,
situation. I can see it at 101. I can see anywhere those kinds of products are sold, or even the ones where CBD or, those types of products are already being sold. I would expect those would be primary places where we'd see applications. But what's interesting about this map is you can see there are other locations that could, Lund's Country Village, the 7 High Shopping Center, all could accept these businesses as well. So it's whether or not you want to give a preference. And, some of those neighborhood centers are quite small. And so you have to think about, do you want that kind of business in a smaller commercial center or not? I mean, I think that's really the basic question.
Yeah, and that's the reason why I'm asking that is because I'm kind of wrestling with, do we need to guide this, or is this something that kind of the free market will decide the best places for them? So I'm going back and forth on that, just to jump ahead to comments. And yeah, all right, I'll stop there. Anything else? Otherwise, I'm just going to open the public hearing. We had one person, and I think we may have scared them off with our long line of questioning tonight. But we'll open the public hearing. If anyone would like to comment, seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing. And commissioners, can you put our list up, please? So here's what we need to address, and this will be a recommendation to the city council, or
Yep, Chair, the first item is we're looking for a recommendation on the zoning amendments. And then secondly, we're just looking for, so that's one action. And then the other is almost like a concept plan review. We're just looking for your comments.
Perfect. That makes it easier. We can't screw it up then. All right, commissioners, who has comments or thoughts? I'd love to hear. I'll take any takers.
Jerry, you thinking we should address the first issue and vote on it, and then we can express comments on the second one?
Yeah, that works. We can do that. So, Commissioner Waterman,
If we're going to do that, maybe I just have one more question.
Then shoot, now's the time.
So just then hypothetically, let's just say we did not recommend approval of the zoning ordinance. What then? Like, what happens with the city and all these potential applications? Then it's just
And this is the zoning ordinance.
the zoning ordinance, which stipulates retail cannabis would be covered under the registration.
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Waterman, I think that under our current zoning ordinance, we allow retail in commercial districts. And so staff has been getting calls for 2 years about cannabis businesses, and we've said they will be allowed in our retail business, in our retail zoning districts, but we don't have a registration or licensing process in place. So I think even if you were not to adopt the zoning ordinance amendment,
And it was silent.
and it was silent on cannabis retail or cannabis industrial, they would still be allowed under these retail and industrial areas.
All right, so this is the perfect one to leave up. So around the zoning ordinance amendments, I'm going to read through it again one more time. Does anyone have any comments on this portion? Then we'll go through our other opinions and feedback.
Well, okay. Actually,
Go ahead. Anyone? There's no right or wrong.
so wait, back to, okay, now that I'm reading this again, I mean, it does specify that cannabis retail businesses would be allowed as permitted uses, subject to the registration. So, but I'm just trying to square that with your point earlier about, if this weren't here, if this were silent, it would still be permitted. You'd still have to.
Chair and Commissioner, we're recommending the ordinance change so that it specifically calls out cannabis retail businesses subject to the registration ordinance, so that someone who is reading this code would know that they need to go to that registration ordinance, and then hopefully they'll see that they have to be set back for whatever, and that we only allow 5 in our community. So it's more for clarity than for allowance, if that makes sense.
Great, thanks.
Did that answer your question? Okay. Commissioner Banks, do you have comments? Wonderful. Love it.
Yeah, so addressing the zoning ordinance and looking over what staff has put together, I think the first one where, for commercial purposes, it's excluded, I think is a great catch, to keep, home businesses from being able to, have this at their homes. I think the only thing in looking through this that I would be confused about, and I don't know if it can be reworded or maybe just explained, but the fact that we say limit 5 total under the commercial districts, and then we say again, limit 5 total under the industrial district. I don't know if there's a way to word it to make sure that someone understands that that's total for both and not 5 and 5.
The whole city.
But other than that, I think, putting these ordinances in these amendments in place, certainly with the idea that a registration ordinance is required, it would be a great way for us to really kind of control, what comes in, where does it go, things of that nature, versus if we didn't have these amendments, it sounds like, we still have to allow it, but with less conditions. So I'm in full agreement of this ordinance, with hopefully the exception of maybe tweaking the limit 5 total to somehow clearly indicate that it's 5 for all retails.
Great. Thanks. Other comments on this? Yeah, Commissioner Henry.
Well, again, just a clarifying question for the city. So what we're sending a recommendation to the city council for is relative to these 3 things in the amendment, and not just looking at preference for the PID. Is that correct?
Chair Sewell and Commissioner Henry, yep, we're asking you to take 2 actions tonight. One is the zoning ordinance, which is what's on this screen. And that you're making a recommendation, just like you're making a recommendation for any zoning language change. Then the separate thing we're asking you to do is to answer those questions about the PID preference, the buffers, and whether or not the buffers should be in the registration ordinance or the zoning ordinance. And those are just comments, not an official recommendation, but obviously comments on the record that the council will take into consideration.
Thank you. Okay, that's good for clarifying, and based on what we have to make a recommendation to the city council for, I agree with Commissioner Banks. I think this looks pretty good the way it is, subject to clarifying language in those points.
Sounds good, thanks. Other comments? Who would like to offer? Anyone? Bueller? All right, I'll go then. I think I agree. Yeah, this is a reasonable amendment to the zoning ordinance. So I'll have more commentary on the other section, but yeah, I'm fine with this as well. Any other comments on this particular part before we make a recommendation? All right, then we'll take action on this. Then we'll go back and offer other comments. So I will take a motion to recommend the city council adopt the amendment to the zoning ordinance for items concerning cannabis retail business. Would someone like to make that motion?
Make that motion.
Motion Minion.
I'll second.
Second Maxwell. Staff, please poll the commission.
Minion,
Yes.
Maxwell,
Yes.
Waterman,
Yes.
Banks,
Yes.
Henry,
Yes.
Chair Sewell.
Yes, motion carries. And this will be heard on the
November 21st.
November 21st by the council. All right. Back to our other, what was the date? As I say, 18th? I remember that from the
I-
last meeting, so I was
I-
like, wait.
I apologize. Your meeting is on the 21st. The council's meeting is on November 18th.
Got it. Okay, November 18th.
Just to clarify that, the time of that meeting will be
6:30. The new meeting time starts on January 1st. Thank you.
excellent. Thank you.
Sorry to butt in here. You mentioned earlier in the meeting that the next planning commission meeting is going to be on December 5th, but you just said it's on November 21st?
And Ms. Wishnak will tell you it's been a really tough day for me. I apologize.
calendars
November 21st is your next planning commission meeting. Thank you.
Thanks for
Oh, it's
clarification.
next year, too. Okay. Yeah. All right. Next, let's just offer our comments on these 4 points below PID preference. And again, we don't have to come to a consensus, but let's just offer our opinions. Not applying buffers to daycares and licensed residential care facilities. Buffer requirements in the zoning ordinance versus the registration ordinance. And then applying buffer requirements to industrial type cannabis businesses. These are opinions, so again, we can't get this wrong. So what do we think? Commissioner Waterman, you ready? Okay. Sounds good. Just want to make sure.
So actually, I mean, I spent a lot of time on these questions, and this was one where I did have to sort of phone a lot of friends just to get people's thoughts. So I did just want to share some of that, non-scientific. There's a pretty broad swath of people. There were definitely folks that were pretty well against, taking the emotion out of it, but just frustrated that the state is sort of applying this to the cities, understanding that the state decided it, but just really being concerned about kids, underestimating the dangers for kids, really concerned about the legitimization and romanticization of cannabis is kind of some of the comments. So kind of taking that to heart, along with people who were just completely ambivalent, which actually there was a fair amount who were like, I don't care. And then there were also some of the folks I talked to were definitely like, yeah, go for it, let's tax it, and wanting the access. So kind of broad swath, for whatever that is worth. Regarding these questions, the PID prioritization, I think it could make sense. I think on the extremities of the city could make sense. My only thing is, and I alluded to this in the questions, is just Ridgedale is what gives me some pause. Like one of the consistent comments I heard, and I kind of agree with, is sort of the idea that these should be more of a destination, not necessarily a place where it's like, oh, I'm going to stop at Target, and then Barnes & Noble, then go to the cannabis store. That even for the people that were sort of in favor of it, were like, I kind of want it a little separate, not just like I go to Yum and that's there. So I don't know how that then fits into this, if that's sort of a non-answer to this. But I understand that PID is probably where that makes a lot of sense. Potentially like a single, I can think of some places, again, on the extremities of the city that might just be like a single location where it's retail, it's clearly on an industrial thoroughfare where it's like, yeah, you have to go there specifically for it. You're not just going to pass by. Again, just to reemphasize, a lot consistently the concerns I heard were just about kids and just it becoming a little bit too normal for it to be part of daily life for kids. And I know that maybe I'm outside the boundaries here, just kind of relaying what I've heard. There were, in terms of not applying the buffers to daycares, I didn't hear a lot about I'm sorry, I take that back. Actually, I did hear, like, I think people would be shocked that people were under the assumption, like, of course you're going to regulate that it's not within 500 feet of a day, or, some amount of a daycare. So I think people might be a little bit surprised, but maybe they don't care in the end. I think it's an interesting idea if you look at conditionally approved daycare facilities. And I'll leave that to the council if that's worth it, and if that's administratively feasible, just to at least have something there. The buffer requirement, I agree with the next 2 points. I agree with putting it in the registration ordinance. That makes a lot of sense. And then not having a buffer requirement on industrial types, that also makes a lot of sense to me. So overall I agree kind of with the concept of like maybe trying to shy away from B2 and B3 districts and keeping it up in the original. And I think those are all my points.
Great, thank you. Other thoughts? Commissioner Banks?
Thanks, Chair. So I think I'll start with the second. I'll leave the PID for last. but the not applying the buffers to daycares and licensed residential care facilities. I would hope that because we can get the data, that maybe the city would consider daycares that are that have CUPs. Those facilities, it's not a major concern. Like I guess I don't see anyone going into a cannabis store and making a purchase and then coming out and doing some great harm just because the daycare is within 500 feet. Versus God forbid, we have a gun store over in Glen Lake that's within 50 feet or so from a daycare, and you come out of there and you can have a loaded gun, right? So I don't see too much of a harm in having it, but if it's possible to also include the daycares or CUPs, I would say consider that. I know it's a lot more difficult with the licensed residential care facilities, but maybe we could include those daycares that are standalone businesses. Again, I don't see great harm in it, but maybe something to consider. The last two kind of go hand in hand. One part of me wants to say do the buffer requirements on the industrial types, but it sounds like if you do, then you have to put the buffering requirement on the zoning ordinance. And so that, I think I'm more strongly against having it on the zoning ordinance. I'd rather see it on the registration ordinance for the simple purpose of the non-conforming possibilities. I think it's better that a school, a daycare, a new park has the ability to go wherever it wants to go within the city. And then if there's a cannabis retail store nearby and it closes, then it can't go back in there. I like that idea better than having to wait 12 months for that storefront to be empty. So I guess the buffering requirement I would suggest on the registration ordinance, and because of that, I guess we couldn't, I would be against having it on the industrial type. I hope I captured that correctly. The PID preference, I guess I should have asked the question. I wonder if there's a way, I feel like if we give preference to the PID area for the 5 licenses, we might be, and you guys brought up some great examples, we might be shutting out a small business. I wonder if it's possible maybe that we give preference to the PID area, but then say like once there are 3, then the other ones go back into their line. So there was a great example in our packet where if there's 10 applications and 6 of them are in the PID area, but their position is 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Then 1, 2, and 3, 4 who check all the boxes. They have a location that's not in the PID. Now they get jumped over. So I wonder if then we can jump over, pick the 1, 2, 3 in the PID area, and then put 4, 5, 6 back down, and then give those that are not in the PID an opportunity to be 4th and 5th. I don't know if that's possible or how you would word that. My first thought was we just put all of them in the PID area, but I don't think, from what I've learned tonight, I know that that's not possible. There's no way to word that because we have to allow or fall within the parameters of the 1,000 feet and the 500 feet. So maybe it's just if possible, don't give all the applicants that first opportunity that are in the PID, maybe the first 3, maybe even the first 4. I don't know what the magic number is, but allow some room for someone who may not be able to afford that rent, or they might already have a retail facility, so they don't want to be up there. They just want to use their own, or it might be close to their home in a different area of the city. Give them that opportunity to register and potentially get a license. So that's my only thought on that. I think if push come to shove, if that wasn't possible, then I would say I would be for the PID preference, but I would like to see some parameters where there's some consideration for other areas. So.
Great, thanks. Other comments, opinions? Commissioner Henry, you ready?
Sure, thanks. I'll start with the most straightforward, in my opinion. First, the buffer for industrial cannabis businesses. I agree with the city's recommendation that we don't need that. The third point about the applying to the zoning ordinance versus a registration ordinance, I also agree with the city where it should tie to the registration ordinance, because then, like you said, it's going to be a lot less chances of having to worry about non-conforming properties, and then if somebody vacates, then it's just a whole lot less of a headache. So yeah, I'm completely in agreement with the city on those 2 points. The other 2 points are more nuanced, and that's why we're tasked with having debate, and I'm glad that we had this, because I had certain opinions going in, and then other people's opinions enlightened me a little bit too, and it made me see that it's a larger issue than just, well, should you have it or should you not? It's not straightforward, and there are a lot of layers to these. For example, the PID preference, I think generally it's a good idea because it's the largest commercial area, and as such, I think we do need to have a preference of some sort to have it in there. But like Commissioner Minion brought up, he's concerned about the welfare of the children in the community, as am I, and I think as are most people that live in and work in this community. So we have to be really aware of those concerns. Otherwise, we're not doing our job to serve the community. And for that, people brought the point about Ridgedale. And there's a lot of businesses in Ridgedale that kids are served primarily by candy stores and other things. And I'm assuming, I don't know for sure, but there probably is a kinder care or some kind of a conditional use daycare within the PID that we have to be aware of too. So I don't know what the final disposition of even my comments are, but this is mostly a stream of consciousness. But yes, I think there should be a preference on PID, and I really like Commissioner Banks' idea about having some preference, but not all 5 of the preferences, because we should be able to have a couple, maybe 2 or 3, I agree with you, and then a couple other areas, so it's easier for people who choose to go to these facilities. It's not, you have to go all the way across town. But we also have to be aware of the public safety concerns too. So it can't just say yes or no to the PID. There should be yes, but, and that's where I'm leaning towards. There should have to be other layers to say we do need to keep it in here, but we have to exclude certain areas with it. And that's tied into the second of these bullet points, where not applying buffers to residential care or daycare, in my opinion, I understand that it's onerous for the city to do so, but I also think that the city does a really good job at what it does, and they're adept at using GIS, and even though it is hard, I think it's in the best, highest use of the city's time to make sure that we do focus on the safety of the citizens. So I know it's easy for me to say, but short answer, I don't want to be glib on this one, but city, I want you to do your job to help to increase public safety to the maximum extent. That being said, I like the idea of conditionally used daycare facilities for sure, because we do have the ability to look at those, and it's a lot easier to do so. Non-conditionally used daycares, I understand it's harder to do that, and I can see the argument both ways. But me as a citizen caring about the welfare of all the people in the city, of course I can put my blinders on to all the work that the city has to do to say just do it that way. And that's where my initial preference was, but thanks for opening my eyes about how hard it would be to do that. But I think we should have some debate about that and open it up to the wider conversation. That's where I'm at.
Great, thank you. Other comments? Commissioner Minion?
First off, great job. I really like the PID preference plan as far as, I understand that having everything up along 394 PID is a good idea for commercial, but the fact that you guys have allowed some variance to that and some flexibility to that is good. I really like Mr. Banks' idea of maybe having 3 of those. When it comes to the daycares, but kind of echoing the same thing, to have the residential care facilities have to fall under this, I think it would be kind of onerous on a small family business like that. So I would say no to the small family daycares. But boy, I think of the tobacco lawsuits and the things that were gone after that were brought up, and just Joe Camel. I mean, that was something that we've all kind of seen and known. But there was a good point there made about just that impact that it made on children. And to not cover the larger daycares, particularly the ones that are in these areas close by, I think it'd be good for many reasons to kind of include those in the buffer zones. In regards to the buffer requirements, doing zoning or registration ordinance, I think you guys have done a great job of saying that there's many more advantages to doing the registration ordinance instead of the zoning. But industrial type, I'd really like to see us to be able to put some sort of buffer zone there as well. Maybe I'm asking for it all, but I have a history of helping businesses meet or exceed PCA and EPA requirements. And there's ways to get around PCA laws illegally, but you're still putting things into the air that are exposing people to things. And I think having some sort of buffer there as well is just wise. But overall, man, you guys have done a great job. You put a lot of thought into this, and nice job.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Maxwell, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll go last, I guess, besides you, Chair. For the PID preference, this one I feel maybe a little differently than the rest of you. I would say I'd rather have this type of business distributed throughout the city rather than concentrated in one area. And I'm thinking about using liquor stores as an example. So in the PID, I can think of like going northwest, you've got Total Wine, and then you've got, as you go further east, you've got Haskell's, and then south of the highway, you have the new Wine Side, and there's three in that. Maybe if there's one I'm missing, but that's what I can think of. And to have more cannabis businesses in the same space than liquor stores seems like that's not the identity that we want for Minnetonka, and that is what we would end up with. As you drive through, why are there so many cannabis stores in Minnetonka? So I would rather have them more distributed. You get a little bit more diversity of the type of business potentially if they're distributed and not so concentrated in an area that is highly public facing. I know people outside of the city, I guess, passing through. So that's my thought on that PID one. I also think that, as we talked about, there will be some variability in what comes in through applications, but I would not like to see all of them in the PID. I'd like to see at least, as we talked about, one or two outside of the PID. For the buffers to daycares and licensed residential care facilities, I do not see that there would be an amount of harm by having one of these businesses within 500 feet of a daycare. With daycares, generally young toddlers, infants are driven by their parents. They go straight into the building, and then they might play on the playground in the back, which is heavily fenced so that they're not leaving, and then they get back in their parents' car and leave. So, and you're not going to end up with, as Commissioner Banks said, people coming in and creating harm after having visited or on their way to a cannabis retailer. So I don't see a harm there. I also see there's not the same safety issues as with secondhand smoke or with drunk drivers with cannabis users as there are with potentially other uses. So I do not see an issue there. And I do know it is a lot of cost to the city to do that, and your time is not free, and I do not want to be adding to taxpayer burden for something that in my opinion, does not significantly increase safety. And for licensed residential care facilities, I have a similar opinion. Those would generally be adults who can either make their own decisions or have their carers help with that. For the buffer requirement in the zoning ordinance versus the registration ordinance, you guys have made a great case for having it in the registration ordinance, so I won't rehash that. And then for the industry type cannabis businesses, I do not think we need a buffer there, as industrial type are already generally buffered from the other spaces we would like to buffer from, so I don't think that's a requirement either.
Great, thank you. Any other final thoughts or comments? Otherwise, I will go. I always hate going after Commissioner Maxwell because she always has such great points because they're usually my points too, but you just think of them and express them better and before me. So I'll talk about the PID in just a minute, but I do like the idea though of a little bit of a hybrid with the daycares and licensed residential care facilities, maybe looking at this CUP ones, but finding some sort of medium. There's a happy medium between looking at everything and doing nothing, right? Life is full of compromise, and I think that's what we need to do here. Buffer requirement in the zoning ordinance versus registration ordinance. Yep, I agree with everybody. Applying buffer requirements to industrial type cannabis businesses. I don't see a huge need for that personally, but and then with the PID, this is one where again I've kind of thought the most about this, and I agree. I'm a big proponent of not concentrating but dispersing throughout the city, and I think that while it's just a preference, it's not a mandate or anything like that. I think letting the free market decide, because if you look at it from a couple different points of view, let's say you love cannabis, you love buying cannabis, you want there's people probably who feel that way spread throughout the city, right? I don't want them to have to go to just one spot for them. I want them to be able to access what they want to buy more easily, and have a diverse mix of not only what the businesses look like but also where they are. On the flip side, let's say you don't like cannabis and you don't like the idea of it. You'd hate to have one part of the city where you're always bombarded and overwhelmed when you get to that area. Let's assume it's, let's say, I don't know, bars or adult bookstores, right? Let's say adult shops, we'll call them. If we had a place that had just covered with adult shops, you probably would want to stay away from that if you didn't like that type of thing. So I see it as a similar type thing. That's why, again, it just kind of both directions lead me to probably not having the PID preference. I think let's let the free market dictate where they go, and let that decide rather than have our preference in there. So I appreciate the great discussion tonight. I love hearing all the different points of view, and great job to the staff. I know this has been a ton of work. Just if nothing else, trying to summarize it. You probably had lots of headaches just trying to do that, but you've done a great job, and I think hopefully leads the council to make a great informed decision. So anything else that we missed or you need additional feedback or commentary on?
I don't think so, Chair Sewell. I think that was very helpful, great discussion, and the minutes will reflect all of your points, and we'll also summarize those for the council going into the council's consideration.
Great, and I'm confident that the council will do what they feel is best for the city of Minnetonka, just like everybody up here has. So thank you. And last question, not trying to trick you, but when is the city council going to be discussing this?
It is currently scheduled for November the 18th. That's the current schedule.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. All right. I think we're ready to move on to item 9. We have nothing. Item 10 is adjournment. Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Motion by Minion.
I'll second.
Second by Waterman. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. We are adjourned. Good night.